I already look. I don't need to be punished for these other things that I haven't talked to you about yet because, yeah, all these other they can't prosecute a dead man. So it's like, what?
Right, but do you think anyone's going to really? Do you think Vermont charges you for the courage? Do you think they're really going to give you the death penalty, knowing that there's more things out there? Do you think they're going to say, let's
right?
just move
So
forward?
see, I know
You're in a catch-22, my friend.
I already up, so.
You're in a catch-22, and we're offering you, what is, I think, your best bet. That's your call, buddy. But you're in a catch-22 because Vermont U.S. Attorney's Office, Vermont State isn't going to rush forward and give you what you want, knowing that there's more information.
Yeah, right. They can't give me what I want.
This is 34-year-old Israel Keys. On February 1st, 2012, Israel Keys began to execute the final steps of a plan that he already had in motion. He ran 2 heaters inside a shed to keep it comfortable, and then placed a tarp along the floor to help control any mess. And after canvassing several locations, Israel Keys decided that the Common Grounds espresso coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska would be his target. He decided to execute this plan on February 1st because he had already purchased tickets to board a cruise ship from New Orleans to Mexico the very next morning. Israel waited in his car fairly close to the coffee stand, listening to a police scanner for any potential distractions. At around 8 p.m., a major incident was broadcast over the scanner, quite far across town. This was the moment Israel Keys decided to strike. Israel covered his face with a ski mask and walked up towards the coffee stand. He then noticed it was just one young lady working, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig. Samantha then asked if she could help Israel, and he ordered an Americano coffee. As Samantha turned around to prepare the coffee, Israel lifted a handgun out of his pocket and pointed it directly at her. She turned back around, only to see the barrel of a gun pointing directly at her face. Israel then ordered the young lady to turn off all of the lights and back away from the window. He then climbed through the window and ordered her to get down on her knees. Israel then tied Samantha up, took any money he could find from the coffee stand, and made it clear that he was going to be taking her with him. Samantha then pleaded with Israel, stating that her father would be by to pick her up at any minute. But after very little hesitation, Israel gagged Samantha and began pushing her and dragging her towards his vehicle. He forced her into the passenger seat of his vehicle and drove them both back to his house that he shared with his girlfriend and his young daughter. Israel threatened Samantha repeatedly, telling her that if she were to make any noise, he would kill her. Israel was then able to move Samantha from his vehicle to the shed next to his house, which he had already prepared for the attack without anybody noticing. He cranked up the volume on a radio that he had in the shed as he tied up Samantha some more. He then forced Samantha to tell him where her debit card was. She told him it was currently in her boyfriend's truck. At this point, Israel was planning to hold on to Samantha for ransom and have the money placed into her own bank account, which he would then access using her debit card. So Israel left Samantha tied up and locked up inside the shed for a short period of time while he went off to break into her boyfriend's truck and fetch the debit card. When he came home from fetching the debit card, Israel then walked inside his house and quietly poured himself a glass of wine. He then went back out to the shed. Israel Keys then brutally raped and murdered 18-year-old Samantha Koenig via strangulation. When he was finished, he then wrapped her body in the plastic tarp that he had laid along the floor in his shed. Then he placed her body into a shed cabinet and turned off the heaters and the radio. He then went back inside his house where his daughter and his girlfriend lay asleep. At this point it was getting fairly early, so Israel packed up for his cruise, woke up his daughter for school, and then headed towards the airport. The cruise he was taking ported out of New Orleans, so Israel flew to New Orleans and then boarded the ship. When his cruise was over, Israel Keys went on a crime spree throughout Texas, where he had robbed a home and then set it on fire.
What do you think about big it's where did you need the brush on the other side? There's a small driveway here, there's a small shed down there.
And then he robbed a National Bank of Texas at gunpoint. He then flew home to Anchorage, Alaska on February 19, 2012. After being home for a few days, Israel decided that he needed to dispose of Samantha's body. So, he began the process. Strangely, as he removed her from the cabinet in the shed, he felt the urge to have sex with her once again, and Israel Keyes then had intercourse with Samantha's body again. Once he was finished, he had another idea. He stitched Samantha's eyes open using fishing line and applied makeup in a way to attempt to make her look like she was still alive. Israel then grabbed a recently released newspaper and held the newspaper in front of Samantha for a photo. He then wrote up a ransom letter to Samantha's family, stating that if they want to see Samantha alive again, they must deposit $30,000 into Samantha's bank account. He then hid the ransom letter and the gruesome photo at a dog park. Shortly after, he texted Samantha's boyfriend the location of the note and the photo. After another couple days had passed, Israel decided that he now really needed to dispose of her body. So, he began the process again. Israel completely dismembered Samantha and dumped her remains into the Matanuska Lake just outside of Anchorage, Alaska. Sometime during the first week of March 2012, Israel Keyes decided to go on a trip to Las Vegas, Nevada. So, he hopped on a plane and flew there. He then rented a white Ford Focus and drove himself to Arizona. While in Arizona, he put on a different outfit and a mask and withdrew $400 from Samantha's bank account. This activity immediately alerted the FBI, and they began to check ATM cameras and monitor Samantha's bank account activity. On the ATM camera footage, they were not able to make out Israel's identity, but they were able to pinpoint the white Ford Focus he was driving. Unfortunately, they were not able to work out what the license plate was. Just 2 days later, on March 9, 2012, Israel Keyes put on another disguise and visited an ATM in Texas, where he withdrew money from Samantha's bank account again. The FBI then immediately informed Texas authorities to keep a keen eye out for the white Ford Focus. Just 4 days later, on March 13, 2012, a Texas police officer monitoring the highway witnessed a white Ford Focus parked outside of a Texas motel. The officer waited inside his vehicle and monitored the white Ford Focus, and when Israel entered the Ford Focus, the officer followed him. Due to suspicion that this may in fact be the vehicle that they were looking for, the officer kept his eye on Israel's speed limit, and when Israel went just 4 miles per hour over the posted speed limit, the officer pulled Israel over. Israel then handed his Alaskan driver's license over to the police officer, and this immediately set off alarms due to the bank account belonging to a current kidnap victim whom also lived in Alaska. The officer then immediately called for backup. As the officers proceeded to search the white Ford Focus, they found a face mask that matched the one captured by the ATM camera. They also found rolls of cash that were covered in a dye, which is used to signify that the money had been stolen from a bank, as well as a gun and Samantha's debit card. Upon this discovery, the officers arrested Israel Keyes and took him into custody and transferred him back to Anchorage, Alaska. For the initial couple weeks following his arrest, Israel was constantly confronted with overwhelming evidence against him. However, he denied everything and refused to talk. However, on March 31st, 2012, Israel Keyes admitted some involvement regarding the abduction of Samantha Koenig. He admitted that he did in fact abduct her from the Common Grounds coffee stand on February 8th. But Israel then decided to try to strike a deal with the investigators to protect his daughter from hearing any details. He told them that if they keep the details of the crimes away from the media and the public, that he will then tell them everything about what he did and how he did it. He said he will tell them the entire story. But then, Israel also said that he has a lot more stories to tell. A few days later, Israel Keyes went on to provide the details of the abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig to the police, leading them to the location at Matanuska Lake where he disposed of her remains.
Good evening, everyone. The massive search for missing barista Samantha Koenig is over, but it's not the news family and friends were hoping for. Anchorage police announced today they found a body they believe to be Samantha Koenig's in Matanuska Lake out in the valley.
At Matanuska Lake Monday afternoon, a worst-case scenario showed up just outside Kevin Sturgeon's house.
I just thought people were ice fishing. That's all I thought. I had no idea intentions on what was going on.
Rumors of a horrible development in the Samantha Koenig abduction became a lot more suspicious out in the Matanuska Valley. Kevin says snow machines started showing up.
Just riding back and forth and hearing chainsaws like Just that's all I've been hearing until I came out and I just seen a bunch of people.
And all it took was the Anchorage Police Department Monday to make it official.
Earlier today, a forensic dive team discovered in Matanuska Lake what investigators believed to be the body of Samantha Koenig.
Just after this discovery, on April 18, 2012, a federal grand jury returned an indictment on Israel Keys to face charges for the kidnapping and murder of Samantha Koenig.
The indictment charges Keys, age 34, with 3 counts. First count is kidnapping resulting in the death of Samantha Koenig. The second charge charges receiving and possessing ransom money. And the third count charges access device fraud. This is a first superseding indictment that replaces the original indictment against Israel Keys. The indictment alleges that Israel Keys abducted Samantha Koenig from the Common Grounds coffee stand on Tudor Road on February 1st, 2012, and that he took her against her will to his white pickup truck that was parked across the street. The allegations continue that he confined her and intentionally killed her early the next morning. The indictment also alleges that on the same night as the abduction, Keys stole a debit card from a vehicle that Ms. Koenig shared that was parked near her residence, and that he further obtained the PIN number for that card from Samantha Koenig. Keys then sent text messages from Samantha's cellular phone in an effort to conceal the abduction. According to the indictment, Keys then left Alaska and boarded a flight to Texas early the next morning. The indictment further alleges that on February the 24th, Keys sent a text message using Samantha's cellular telephone for the purpose of demanding that ransom money be placed in a bank account connected to the stolen debit card. With the help of the reward money that was generously donated by members of this community, the Koenig family was able to place money into the account. And the indictment alleges that Keys then used that stolen debit card to withdraw this ransom money from ATM machines here in Alaska, in Arizona, in New Mexico, and in Texas. Law enforcement was able to track these ATM withdrawals. The crime of kidnapping and killing Samantha Koenig, as charged in this indictment, carries a maximum penalty of life or death.
Then, shortly after this, Israel went on to mention that he had also been involved in the disappearances of many other people throughout the USA between the years of 1997 and 2012. However, he refused to go into any further details. Then, on May 23, 2012, Israel Keys had his first appearance in court in order to set a date for the trial. Somehow, during this court appearance, Israel Keys managed to break out of leg restraints and dive over the handrail behind him into the gallery members sitting in the front row. Fortunately, the officers in the courtroom were able to quickly regain control of the situation by tackling Israel and tasing him.
It was filed shortly after the court issued the order in this matter setting today's hearing. Our position is that at this particular juncture, we're not
Judge, can we go ahead and clear the courtroom? Can we go ahead and just clear the courtroom for now?
Make sure you get all your stuff.
At this point, prosecutors involved in the case were seeking that a trial take place sometime around 10 months after his initial court appearance, which would make the trial take place around the end of January 2013. During the months between Israel Keyes' first court appearance and his projected trial date of January 2013, Israel took part in several different interviews with police. During these interviews, Israel displays a disturbingly casual demeanor and a complete lack of empathy for his victims. Investigators would even go on to state that he appeared bored at times. Let's now take a look at some moments from those interviews.
That was the delay actually getting in here is we knew you had some legal questions, and so we reached out for him to say, hey, Israel says he's got some questions. Are you guys available to speak to him? And, I couldn't even get one. One of them was in court. The other one said, basically, what after yesterday. So they didn't think that was too funny. And
why are they afraid I'd actually get away? Well, that would be embarrassing for them, I guess.
No, it's. I don't think that they were looking at it from that perspective.
Lawyers just don't like excitement. That's all it is.
Well, it's more of a understanding that they thought we were kind of working towards the goal, and they're working on trying to keep Vermont on board and doing everything.
I would have sent them an anonymous letter.
When Israel Keyes spoke with investigators providing details about the murder and kidnapping of Samantha Koenig, he believed that he was striking a deal. Israel requested that his case be kept as quiet as possible from the media in return for the information he provided. During this conversation, Israel also let officers know that for about 14 years of his life, starting in 1997, he believed that he was basically two different people. The version of himself that all of his family and friends would know him as was a normal man that would go on to live a regular crime-free life, working as a handyman, contractor, and construction worker. However, behind the scenes, there was a completely different version of him. This version was a serial killer, serial rapist, serial arsonist, bank robber, and abductor, who would travel the country searching for his next victim. He would hide something he referred to as kill kits in remote locations throughout the states. Locations like this one. In these kits, he would leave what he believed was the necessary equipment needed to complete an abduction, murder, or armed robbery. This one consisted of a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket, which he filled with zip ties, ammunition, guns, silencers, duct tape, and Drano to accelerate human decomposition. During this same conversation, Israel admitted to the murder of a couple that lived in Vermont. While he spoke about the murder, investigators listening in from the next room Googled missing Vermont couple and found a picture of Bill and Lorraine Courier. The picture was brought to Israel, and the investigator asked, "Are these the two people that you killed?" Israel glanced at the image and quickly replied, "Yes." He was then asked, "Have you ever met them or run into them before?" Israel replied, "Nope." Israel then went on to explain how it happened, stating that he dressed in black from head to toe and broke into Bill and Lorraine's house while they were asleep. He walked into their bedroom holding a gun, and when they woke up, they were in a slight daze, and it took them a few moments to realize what was happening. Israel then ordered the couple to roll onto their stomachs while he zip-tied their hands and feet. He asked them where all of their valuables were as he raided through their belongings. After about 15 minutes, he told them that they were all leaving the house. He dragged them both into the garage and forced them into a vehicle. He then drove them to an empty house that was currently for sale. He forced the couple inside, and after brutally murdering Bill, he then raped Lorraine twice and murdered her as well. He then stuffed their bodies into large 55-gallon trash bags and hid them underneath garbage and wood in the corner of the basement. He then left the house. Israel stated it took him 6 hours, start to finish, and nobody suspected a thing. After telling the police all of these details, Israel expected that the investigators would hold up their side of the agreement by keeping his case out of the news as much as possible. Unfortunately, soon after he told them, Israel caught wind that he was all over the news in Vermont. This made Israel more and more difficult to extract information from, because now he felt the investigators were not living up to their end of the deal that they made. With all of that in mind, that brings us back to the interrogation room, right where we left off.
Yeah. And so they're kind of wondering where we're at with that. Where are we at with what's changed since yesterday?
More
What's changed for you?
Nothing. Possibly additional charges.
Basically, what the fuck?
Right, but I mean, still, even still, from their perspective, I mean, come on, let's face it. Yeah, what happened yesterday? Ooh, I'm a bad guy. I tried to escape, but let's be honest. Nobody really thought I was a good guy before that, so. It's not like being escaping suddenly makes me untrustworthy. I was kind of untrustworthy before that, so.
Eventually, Israel recognized the level of difficulty involved in trying to keep his case out of the media, so he decided to change his request. He then went on to tell the investigators that the only way he'll provide further information was if he was promised that he would be sentenced to death.
I don't need to be punished for these other things that I haven't talked to you about yet, because all these others, they can't prosecute a dead man, so it's like, what?
Right, but do you think anyone's going to really, do you think Vermont charges for the courage? Do you think they're really going to give you the death penalty knowing that there's more things out there? Do you think they're going to say, let's
right,
just move
so
forward?
see, I know,
You're in a catch-22, my friend.
I already up, so.
You're in a catch-22, and we're offering you what is, I think, your best bet. That's your call, buddy, but, you're in a catch-22 because Vermont U.S. Attorney's Office, Vermont State isn't going to rush forward and give you what you want, knowing that there's more information.
Well, yeah, right, they can't give me what I want anyway.
You may have noticed Israel's lack of attorney throughout this entire video. Well, it has been said that this is likely due to Israel Keyes' strange obsession with another serial killer who goes by the name of Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy also traveled throughout the USA, murdering people along his travels, sometimes posing as if he had a broken arm and needed help with something, or that he had lost his dog. When Ted Bundy was finally arrested and tried in court, Ted Bundy also made the choice to represent himself. Anyways, Israel Keyes' final interview with investigators took place on November 29th, 2012. And just 3 days later, on December 2nd, 2012, at exactly 5:57 a.m., a prison guard noticed a red streak on Israel's cell floor. And when they approached his cell, they found Israel Keyes lying face down, covered in blood, and deceased from what appeared to be a plethora of very elaborately planned, self-inflicted wounds. Under Israel's mattress, they found disturbing pictures of skulls that Israel drew using his own blood. And next to his body laid a 4-page note that was almost completely destroyed due to being soaked in blood. The FBI was able to restore the note to a point that it was almost legible. One quote from Israel's note read, "You may have been free. You loved loving your lie. Fate had its own scheme. Crushed like a bug, you still die." Further details surrounding his death can be found online, but I will warn that they are quite gruesome and are not for the faint of heart. American serial killer Israel Keyes was pronounced dead on December 2nd, 2012. After years of investigating the case of serial killer Israel Keyes, law enforcement now believe that Israel is responsible for 11 murders throughout the USA.
He was very specific about some of the details he gave and very vague about others, leading me to believe that he was certainly holding a lot of cards up against his chest at the time he died.
Keeping his grasp on control over authorities, the investigation, and his victims, even from the grave. One of the
Tragedies that go along with a case like this and a guy like this is that he takes to the grave many of the things that they would love to know. And in a way, it's the ultimate act of cruelty.